Good morning, everybody. This looks like a small group, but that's okay. And people might join us as we go through this morning. You're all very welcome. This session is on understanding and reducing energy usage. It's presented by the Green Arts Initiative in Ireland in collaboration with Theatre Forum. We're obviously all keeping an eye on Budget 2023 as news of that comes into us this morning. We'll know for definite at lunchtime today what's happening. But we do have information about the temporary business energy support scheme. And what's happening with that is that small to medium businesses will be able to claim 40% of the difference in their energy costs to a maximum of €10,000 per month. And that's going to be operated through revenue. So we've lots more to find out about how that actually might work and the potential impact of that. But we'll know more about that as we go on. And we're going to come back to that later in the meeting too. But for now, I'm delighted to hand you over to Katrina Fallon.
Good morning, everybody. And I should say, I should preface this by, I'm dialing in from West Kerry where I live, and I normally go into the local hub to use their very good broadband, but ironically they have no electricity today because they have a sort of planned outage of electricity. So I'm at home, it's very wet and very windy, so if my bandwidth drops, Irma will let me know and she will present for me, but for the moment we're hoping, fingers crossed, that that you'll all be able to hear me. So this is a kind of a rerun in a sense of an event we ran a number of weeks ago, but just because of the whole topic of energy and energy prices being so topical, we decided we'd come back to it. And we're a small group, so we can really make it as informal as you like. But I suppose just to say that obviously energy is such a huge topic at the moment, gas and electricity prices in particular, it's kind of headline news, every news broadcast on all the newspapers. And we're also, I suppose, really conscious that it's an extremely stressful time for everybody because the uncertainty around rising prices and the uncertainty about what the future holds, both people for their own homes, but also for people running small businesses. And so we're very mindful of that. And I suppose that's part of our motivation in running this event. But we're also coming from the Green Arts Initiative is really hoping to support the arts sector generally to reduce its carbon footprint. That's one of our key aims. So that's always in the back of our mind. And I suppose in some ways when if we reduce our energy usage, we're also reducing our carbon footprint, but it's not the way that we would want to do it in a sort of a stressful environment where people are concerned about meeting their costs. So, and finally, the whole issue of supply and pressure on the grid, that's another concern that a lot of people have. Is there a possibility that there will be blackouts during the winter? Now, I've a couple of contacts in the ESB networks and in EirGrid, and the general feeling is that it's unlikely that that will happen. Not impossible, but unlikely. And actually, I'm going to start with an interesting slide that kind of illustrates that a little bit. But the key part of the first presentation I'm going to do is just on how to read and understand your electricity bill, based on the whole premise that many of you would know that what you don't measure, you can't manage. So really, we're trying to give you, I suppose, a starting point from which to look at your electricity bill. So it's a little bit, it's not the most exciting of topics, but we'll try to get through it fairly quickly. And if you have any questions, we'll be delighted to answer those. So I'm just going to, just one moment, I'm going to share my screen. Any luck? Let's work. Slideshow. And so I'm just going to actually start with this. I don't know if any of you have heard of a website. I'm sure Nick is joining us from Dunamis, the technical manager with Dunamis in Portlaoise, and he might, I'm guessing, have looked at this website before, but it's the Smart Grid dashboard for EirGrid. So it shows us at any given time how much renewable energy, well, first of all, what the demand for electricity is, but how much renewable energy is on that electricity grid. So this is a snapshot. This was at about 7 o'clock this morning. I'm an early riser, and I just took a screenshot of it, and it shows the kind of picture that the state is hoping to see, which is that over 62% of our electricity at 7 o'clock was coming from renewable energy. That was largely because of wind. So you can see in the orange line and the blue line, the orange line is the demand as Ireland wakes up and the demand for electricity ratchets up. And the blue line is the wind generation. So a nice strong element of wind generation today. And that's what we need. that and the flattening of the curve, and we might come back to that later. So this was we originally did this about 2 weeks ago, this presentation, but just an informal look at your electricity usage. And I suppose we're looking at how to read and understand your electricity bill. I'm just going to move this thing out of my way, and why that's important. We're looking at how to record and analyze, what matters in the information that's on that electricity bill. What does analyzing your bill tell you about your electricity usage? Nick is going to give us a bit of a presentation talking about his from questions and answers. But maybe just to take this as an example of, this is an Electric Ireland bill. All electricity bills will essentially have the same information. Electric Ireland is one of the easiest to read. Anything from Bord Gáis or Flow Gas, those would be the most difficult electricity bills to read, but they contain fairly standard information. So if we look at, in the top right-hand side, you have the account number, which is obviously unique to your account, but you've also got your MPRN, which is the unique identifier number for your business and your electricity usage. The front page of your bill, because it generally comes in 2 pages, will tell you if your meter was read or not. That's always very important because it's an indicator as to how accurate that information is. If your bill is estimated, you're really it's only a kind of an educated guess about how much electricity you've used. So you've missed an opportunity to understand your electricity usage better. Now, smart meters are coming in, and many of you in a domestic setting will already have a smart meter. The rolling out of the smart meters for businesses seems to be a little bit behind that. But I suppose one of the interesting maybe downsides to having a smart meter is, up to now, the ESB networks and the grid don't know when you use electricity, when you as a customer use electricity at one of those critical times, particularly 5 to 7 p.m. and maybe 7 to 9 in the morning. Once you have a smart meter, and they do know this, but once you have a smart meter, they will know when you, say, Irma McLaughlin at 32 Lenore Drive, they will know when you are using your electricity between 5 and 7 p.m. And the emphasis will probably be to try and encourage you not to, rather than penalize you for doing so. And at least that's the hope. The other thing on this bill is it tells us this dates from December of 2018, and the customer is being told, this is a venue that allowed me to share their information anonymously, but they're being told that the PSO levy is going to decrease from that October. So it'll be interesting. We're going to come back to that because the PSO levy does play a big role in the bills of small and medium-sized businesses. So on the second page, you've information, and this was the page when I first started to really look at electricity bills. Terrified. There just seemed to be so much detail, and a lot of it seemed quite inexplicable. But if we break it down a bit, for example, it's going to tell you whether your meter, you can see that in this instance, there was a price change. It tells you whether the reading was estimated or actual, and we looked at why that's so important. It's noted there beside each of the readings. And then under the unit usage and unit price, so those are 2 really critical pieces of information. How much units, if you have a night meter, and in the case of this venue, they did have a night meter, so that means that they're paying a slightly different rate of electricity at night, usually around half what they're paying during the day. So in this instance, in the lovely days of lower electricity prices, the unit price for nighttime was just under 14 cents, and for daytime was just over 7 cents. And obviously that's changed a lot in the intervening years. The bill also gives you information about what usage. Usage is really only appears as an item on your actual bill. 41 or just over 41 euros. If you see that as a business, if you see that cropping up, and if it's over 25 to 30 euros per bill, it's worth looking into it because it can be rectified. There's a small change that can be made by a good electrical contractor. They can install a small piece of equipment. The payback is about 4 to 5 years. So that's worth doing if it appears in your bill. It does not appear in everybody's bill. It's a kind of a flow in the system that the system doesn't like, and it penalizes you for it. So if we go down to a little bit more detail, looking at the other items that you're paying for, one that crops up a lot, and it was a bit mysterious to me when I first started looking at electricity bills, is this whole issue of a maximum import capacity charge. And that boils down to the fact that every house, every user of electricity, every premises, whether it's a domestic or a business premises, has an allowance, a maximum import capacity allowance. And that basically allows the grid and the ESB networks to understand what the maximum amount of electricity you as a business will ever draw down. So that all things being equal, if every business in the country ramped up to their maximum needs, so there would be enough electricity on the grid to cope with that. So it's always a little bit above what you'd need, and it's measured in kVA. So in this instance, the maximum import capacity is 100 kVA. So most art centres, theatres will have an MIC above 30 generally. And once it goes above 30, you pay per unit. So you can see how this is, how you're billed. So it's the kVA by the number of days, by the rate that's been set by the CRU. And that's the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities. Now, all that sounds like a lot of acronyms and a lot of detail, but it does boil down to quite a bit of money, as you'll see. So in this instance, this venue is paying €400 plus VAT for their maximum import capacity, for their allowance. And it also figures in your PSO levy. So if you look down to where on your bill to where your PSO charges are, that is going to be based on whatever maximum import capacity allowance you have been set. So that sounds tedious, but it's worth looking at your bill to see what your MIC is. In the case of this particular premises, they never really went above about 72. So in other words, you're paying for every bit of allowance that you have, whether you use it or not. And in this instance, we just did a rough calculation, which I'm going to come to now in a minute, as to what the difference would be if they brought that MIC down. So what is the PSO levy and how is it calculated? Well, it's the public service obligation. It's a subsidy charge to all electricity customers in Ireland. That's domestic as well as businesses. And the idea was really that it supported kind of policy objectives around, particularly really around renewable energy. It was originally also set up for indigenous fuels, God help us, including peat, which is the most carbon dense fuel that you can burn. So if you're still burning briquettes, you might just maybe think about that. But the proceeds from that PSO levy was a way of paying companies and the state that had invested in renewable energy, particularly in wind farms, to make sure that they had a guaranteed rate. And that rate is calculated every October, and we're going to come back to that, but it's calculated by the CRU. So it does tend to change from year to year, depending on the level of support, usually the level of support that the wind energy sector needs in Ireland. So just going back to that, if we looked at this particular venue having a lower MIC, which is possible, you need a good electrical contractor, you need to be very sure that you're doing the right thing, but if there's a potential to reduce it, it's certainly worth looking into. And so the possibility is for saving up to nearly €1,400 per year by adjusting that. Now that was based on the PSO levy of that particular bill, which was towards the end of 2018, I think. So if you're hopefully you're going to look at your electricity bills with a view to actually capturing the data that's in them. If you want a really simple way of calculating how many kilowatt hours you use in a year, and this I suppose is very relevant for anybody who's trying to budget for next year and the year after, you need to know how many kilowatts you're using. That's the best way really to calculate at least a chunk of the costs. The other costs, the PSO goes up and down. The other costs tend not to go up and down as much, standing charges and so on. So if you have a good grasp of how many kilowatts you're using, it's easier to calculate what you're going to be spending on that next year. So you can simply go get the two bills for, say, for example, for January 2019 and 2020. You note the previous reading for each item in your bill. So that would be for day and night. You might just have a 24-hour rate. You might have a day and a night rate. And you subtract the older reading from the most recent reading. And that'll essentially give you your kilowatt usage for the year. It just doesn't give you any kind of granular detail as to when or whether there's any divergence between one year and another. So there's just a figure there for how you can convert that to CO2 if you want to work out what your carbon footprint is for your electricity. But I'd really recommend that you set up a simple spreadsheet. I say simple, it probably doesn't look that simple, but it takes maybe about 3/4 of an hour to set this up. And that would look at things like, the period. So it was for January, the number of days, 31 days.
In Performing Arts, may I help you?
The amount of kilowatt hours used during the day, the amount of kilowatt hours used at night, the total kilowatt hours, whether the reading was accurate or estimated. That's a really important piece of information to have when you're looking back over your bills. The cost per day, the rate for the night electricity, and then what those total costs were. And then there are those other charges, like your standing charges, your PSO levy. Sometimes you'll get a winter demand charge depending on the contract that you've agreed with your electricity supplier. You'll all have your service capacity charge. So that's your MIC allowance again. Sometimes there's a small electricity tax, there might be a wattless charge, and then you'll get your total bill. And it'll look something like this. So this is the spreadsheet that we put together for that particular venue, where we kind of put all of those little bits of information into a spreadsheet. To sit down and do that for 2 years is almost a day's work, especially if you're not used to doing it. But to do it incrementally over time, so to set the basic spreadsheet up, and as each bill comes in, if you can encourage somebody in your organization, probably you, to put that information in, it just means that you have a much better grasp of what's happening. So why is that level of detail helpful or useful? What can you get from it? Well, just for an example, looking at this particular venue, the total electricity costs for 2018 were almost 28,000, and for 2019, almost 26,000. So I suppose if you're looking at that, maybe in a set of management accounts, and from one year to another, you could make the assumption, our electricity usage went down. We spent less on electricity last year, so we must have used less electricity. But of course, that's not necessarily the case. And in the example of this particular organization, even though the spend had dropped, the usage had actually increased. So it was, I think, when you compare 2019 with 2018, in the case of this venue, their usage had increased by almost 5,500 kilowatts. Now, the average electricity usage for a domestic dwelling is around 4,000. So that was enough to comfortably service a domestic dwelling in Ireland for a year. So just be wary, I suppose, of looking at it. That's why, if you look at your total expenditure for a year, you might make the wrong assumption. So that's where actually keeping an accurate assessment of it really does help. So in fact, what changed in this particular venue's case was that the levy, the PSO levy, had decreased significantly between 2018 and 2019. So there was a drop of over 2,000 euros in the money that was spent on the PSO levy between the 2 years. And that's not going to be information that's readily available to you unless you're keeping a bit of an accurate assessment of what you're doing. So as I say, all small businesses, all small theatres, because of the nature of what they're doing, are going to have an MIC higher than 30. So the PSO levy can really affect your bills, because it's the MIC allowance multiplied by the levy for that year, multiplied by the number of days. So it went from 364 to 264 in 2019, and this year, as of up to the end of this year, it's €1.63. And interestingly, at the end of this year, the rate has been set in October, as far as I know, of this year, it's changing to 0. And I think that's the first time ever. So that means that from then on, there will be, in fact, no PSO levy on your bill, which would make a big difference to some organizations, but unfortunately not enough in the scale of what's happening with the price of energy. So using that data, we were able to kind of extrapolate the information in that spreadsheet and just have a broader sense of where the electricity costs were going. So only a little over half was actually spent on electricity. So you can see the PSO levy and the service capacity for that allowance, they're two of the big chunks of spending, and obviously you've got that as well. 2019 was a little bit better because the service capacity, that import capacity charge, had dropped. So an interesting thing to say for this year is that the CRU has published a decision paper, and basically what they're saying is, because of obviously anybody in renewable energy who's producing renewable energy is making a lot of money rather than losing money. So the argument for supporting them in any way is gone. And what is going to happen is that the PSO levy will actually go into a minus for next year. And that means at a certain point next year, the state will actually be reallocating money through your electricity bill to all electricity customers. And that will make the biggest difference, ironically, to those that have the big MIC, the big maximum import capacity allowance. But at least it's something, it's a little bit of light, I suppose, in terms of the overall costs of what we're spending on electricity. So that's just a rough kind of calculation of the kind of rates. As I say, even a domestic customer, I think would get something like 89 euros and 10 cents. Small commercial customers, 311. And then depending on your level of MIC, it goes up. And that's the first time that's happened since the whole PSO levy came in. So what can we learn from our bills? So what's really useful is just to see how much electricity, if you have a night rate meter, and of the venues we looked at, 6 out of 7 did have night rate meters. So if you're using more than 10% of your electricity at night, why is that? Because it shouldn't be more than about 10 to 15% at a maximum. But also look at the patterns of your usage. Are you using a lot of electricity in the summer months when you would expect to be using less? What's driving that? And you'll have that information now if you set up that spreadsheet. Compare the years as we've done. You know, when you compare one year with another, if electricity usage is rising, again, what's driving that? Everybody's really hoping to look at reducing electricity usage, not increasing it. And once you have that baseline energy usage shared with your staff team and use that as a target for reduction, because it's amazing once people know, once you have an actual figure, how that can be quite inspirational to say, you know, let's set a 10% reduction for this year. That will inspire people to do something about it because it seems more attainable. And what are the quick wins? And I think Nick might help us a lot with this as well. But I suppose be ruthless about turning off equipment not in use. You know, no standby usage. Use a power strip with switches to turn everything off. Turn off lights when not in use. If it's safe to do so, use natural light instead of switching on all the building lights. And I think even though people would say that they're minding electricity, it's still a very common failing. Maybe now with the increased costs, it's changed a little bit, but to go into a building and find lights on in rooms that really didn't need them, it happens so often. So I think that's something that, you know, you think about, we were just chatting about this earlier, in an auditorium where maybe people are doing a get-in, they go off for a cup of coffee or a break, they might leave all the house lights on. Is that something that's done? Is there kind of wastage? All of that is going to mean much more now because each kilowatt of electricity that you're using is so much more expensive than it was. So therefore, any kilowatt that you save is saving you much more. If you haven't already done so, convert your building lighting to LED. Consider sensor lighting systems in storerooms, toilets, stairwells, corridors, and even dressing rooms. And that really is a big potential saver. There are a lot of theatre buildings, art centres where corridor lights are on all day, dressing room lights are on throughout a get-in day, or even though most people might be on the stage. So something well worth looking at. Come together as an organisation and identify ways in which you can reduce usage, because each building is different. And if you involve the other people that you work with, you may work with only 2 or 3 other people. But if you sit down together as a group, if you involve everybody that's in that building, it's much more likely to have traction with people than if somebody decides, one person decides and tries to get everybody else on board that way. Look into the possibility of installing PV panels on your roof. So that might be an option for some. And this is probably not a bad time to at least look into the feasibility of that. You know, is your roof suitable? Is it owned by the local authority? Are there any heritage concerns? Could you get a quote from a number of suppliers just to get a sense of whether your building is suitable or not and what the possibilities are? There is a new scheme, kind of one of the final pieces in the whole microgeneration initiative by the government. So one of the latest pieces just announced in the last couple of weeks, and that is around support, so grants for small businesses who want to install up to 6 kilowatts of PV panels on their roof. So that's something worth considering as well. And that's it from me, I think. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Now, since we are a small group, I don't know if there's anybody that has any questions on that before we move on to Nick. You can always put questions in the chat, or I don't know, do we have a Q&A function? So Nick has got a lot of really practical experience based on his many years in Dunamis. So I'm going to hand over to Nick now, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the main achievements they have made in reducing their usage in Dunamis. Thanks, Nick.
No bother. I'll keep this short. I won't bother sharing screens or anything. But basically, you kind of covered it all. You kind of covered it all in there. The main thing is the building lighting in the daytime use. Don't get too caught up on changing your theatre lighting. So anytime that you've got a fluorescent tube that goes, change it for an LED, and that'll save you. The fluorescent tube is around about 58 watts, and an LED tube is 20. So it's only a third of the usage. And it's a straight swap. You don't have to get electricians in to do it. The only caveat is if it's an emergency unit, you will probably need to leave one fluorescent tube in it, but you can pick and mix. So you can leave a fluorescent tube on one side of a double unit and an LED tube on the other side of the double unit, and that covers your would cover your emergency lighting. Or you can sister a bulkhead beside your emergency light and bypass the emergency unit and put them both to LED tubes. But the LED tube thing is a simple retrofit, and it's the same with PL downlighters. Quite a lot of the venues would have these recessed lights with 2 CFL fluorescents in them that would have a glass cover on them. For some reason, every chipper in Ireland seems to have them as well. But they are they can just be a straight swap for an LED panel as well. Again, there's the caveat on the emergency lighting. LEDs, any of the LED retrofit stuff will not work for emergency units. You have to buy a new unit if it's an emergency one. But again, if your lamps are blown or your lamps are dying, then there's a saving to be made. So even if you buy a new unit, you're still going to end up saving in the long run. One of the things there in the presentation, you said about the night rate being 10%. And what will happen is that your day rate and your night rate will start to converge a bit. So our night rate used to be around about 10% of our usage, but now it's closer to 25% or possibly 30%. And the reason is that we've saved so much energy on the daytime use of the building that all of the stuff that kind of sits there tipping away all the time, running main emergency lights, servers, cinema server, the ones that can't be shut down, fridges and so on, they're constant use, they're 24-hour use. So we've found that as we've saved more energy on the daytime use of the building, our day and our night rate have converged. So don't get too worried if you've made some of these changes and your night rate and your day rate are closer than they ought to be, than the 10% thing, because it's actually a good sign. Unless it's your night rate going more, unless you're using more at night, then you need to look at it. The other major savings are the sensor lights. Now I have a few around in the building, but what I did recently was I bought another 40 sensors, and they're only €10 each. And as the season progresses, all of the lights in all of the corridors and all of the dressing rooms are going to be fitted with sensors. Again, it's a really easy retrofit. Most of the technicians in the building can do it. You're not actually changing the wiring of the building as such. All you're doing is you're connecting the sensor in line. So you don't technically have to get an electrician in to do it. If you're fiddling with the emergency lighting, you do have to get an electrician in to do it because they've got to be certified. But if you're just putting in sensors and you have people in your organization with electrical knowledge, you can do that on a very cheap basis. The switching the lights off, and the reason I'm having to do it is because I cannot get the staff to switch off the lights in the likes of the photocopier room and the storeroom. They just leave them on, and it doesn't matter how many signs I put up and how many times I say it, they are just always left on. So much so that I came in yesterday and there was no one in the office, and the cleaner had left all of the office lights, the storeroom light, the back office light, and the photocopier light on. So yeah, couldn't happen sooner. But yeah, really, I think questions and answers are probably better. Oh, there's one thing too. If your bill is estimated, submit a reading, and submit a reading before the end of this month, because if you have an estimated bill this month and then an actual reading next month when the prices go up, you're going to end up paying for the discrepancy between the estimate and the actual. So get an actual in there now while you're still on the slightly lower rate, so that going forward, you're only paying for what you actually use. So I put the where to submit your reading in the link. It's all just with ESB networks. It doesn't matter who your provider is. You put your reading into ESB networks. And I also put a link in there about the various types of meter. So almost all of the commercial and domestic meters are covered on the ESB's website, because they're all slightly different. Some of them are digital, some of them are mechanical, some of them are smart, some of them are not so smart. So it can be a bit difficult. And the other thing as well is, if you are submitting a reading and your meter has historic and current, put in the current reading this month, because even although you might end up paying slightly more this month, you'll end up paying at a lower rate, because they generally take the historic reading. So it's just a little bit of a save you a few bob. It'll only happen once, but it's worth putting in that current reading this time instead of the historic reading. So you will end up with a slightly larger bill, but it'll end up being a slightly cheaper bill by the end of the year when it's all comes out in the wash.
And Nick is absolutely right, and I'd forgotten to say that of course it's really critical, again, whether it's a domestic setting or a small business, to submit a meter reading, because that at least means that you know that the amount of electricity that the bill that you get is accurate in terms of your usage.
Yeah.
And again, the smart meters will change all of that. There'll be no necessity for submitting readings, but until businesses have those smart meters, and it seems to be the case that they're rolling it out domestically first, and then they will target businesses. Until then, yeah, it's a great habit to get in. You can submit it you can submit them whenever you like, but once a month, yeah, probably around the 24th, 25th of the month is probably a good time.
It's usually a good time, but you'll still, if you submit it today, you're probably still in with a chance. But it's definitely worth doing it now, because there will be the imminent increase. And then in terms of what the government are saying on I've forgotten what it's called. It's got too many letters. The Temporary Business Energy Support Scheme. So that's going to run until February, and they're saying it's 40% of the increase. So we don't really know the detail of that at the moment. They're going to backdate it to September. So the best guess is that they'll take whatever you're paying in September as being the base rate, the baseline, and then whatever your bills are between, whatever the rate you're paying between October and February would be taken as the difference. So you'll probably end up with 40% of that difference. So if you're paying 37 pence a unit at the moment and it goes up to 75 pence a unit, then it's 40% of that difference that you'd be paying. So unfortunately, we really don't have the detail until this afternoon. It's welcome. It's always welcome. But really the key to it is reducing your usage in any ways that you can reduce your usage. Switching off is the quick way. Taking out every other tube is another good way of doing it. Obviously, wherever it's a safety concern, there's no way around it. But sensors on everything is a cheap and cheerful way of doing it. And if you if you can get your sensors for like €10 each from CPC, you could pay 24-25 euro for them in the electrical wholesaler. I did a bit of research over it in the last few weeks, and CPC, Farnell are pretty much the cheapest at the moment. They're actually cheaper if you can do the recessed ones. They're only €6 each. If you have cavities and you can do a recessed sensor.
Would it be fair to say, Nick, that in replacing, for example, if you have two CFL strip bulbs, that actually in many cases you can replace those two with just one LED? Because my experience is when people replace those two CFL strips with two LEDs, it's actually too bright.
It's too bright. No, in most of the instances in here as well, I've ended up just putting in one tube, because they're just so much more efficient, and they're tuned better for the color. So so you can. There are points where you have to, but there's an area. Well, this room in here actually has 3 fluorescents in it, which never get switched on. I have just a task lamp that I use at the desk, with a 4-watt LED bulb in it, which is equivalent to like a 60. And it's you know, it's all that's needed. But the photocopier room in at work actually has 4 tubes in it as well, and it's only about 10 feet by 14 feet. So an awful lot of the time there were you know, electricians were just putting stuff in because it was on the spec without necessarily thinking, what does this room actually need? In that room in particular, if the lamps were orientated the other way, you wouldn't need the 2 of them in there. So there are little bits like that, you know. I mean, some of it's just down to the design of the building at the time, and also like a lot of the venues are kind of dating back to that initial access funding. So they were all built in the late 90s. So, you know, people just didn't care quite so much. Now, our building was all done in CFLs and fluorescents. So in terms of the technology at the time, it was relatively low energy. But by changing to LED, we've more than halved that. So, or less than half it.
I think sometimes there is a bit of confusion. Obviously, CFL are lower energy bulbs when you compare them with incandescent, but swapping them out for LED, especially for any lights that are on for a lot of the day, there is significant potential for savings. So it's well worth doing. Sometimes people say they want to wait until each bulb has died. I mean, I'd be inclined to say if you can swap them out, I would swap them out, particularly now because of the dramatic increase in electricity.
Yeah, it is worth doing it, and especially if you're doing like what I kind of find is just doing it in an area. So obviously, when we were doing the cafe, we weren't going to change the cafe piecemeal. So I did in some of the back corridors and stuff. I just bought a couple of boxes of the LED tubes, and as things were going, I was changing them. But then you kind of got to the stage where you're going, you know what, we're just going to change that one out anyway now, because it's that tube has been there for a year. Chances are it's going to start to go in the next couple of months anyway, etc., etc. And then but with the cafe, it was messy. You know, I mean, taking all of those units out and putting in the new units. But it was just a straight swap. Most of you will be familiar with those double CFLs, and you're basically swapping those for one of these, which is, I have loads of spares. I've hardly used the spares. I bought loads of spares because of living in CFL world beforehand, and you just had to keep tons and tons of spares. So it just pops straight in. And again, there's not really any need for an electrician because you're not changing the wiring. The caveat there is if you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. But Niall, you could definitely change these, and the same with Phil.
Yeah, we switched all our front of house lighting and the backstage lighting to LED about 3 years ago, and we noticed significant changes straight away.
Yeah.
Dropping down to usage about 68% less usage overall. You know.
Yeah.
So and we have been switching out, but there are a few still of the old in sort of areas that are not used at all in the building, apart from technicians going up into the air handling unit rooms. It wasn't financially viable at that time to switch those out for LED, so we just let those die, if you know what I mean. And then we're switching them out now. Yeah,
well, that's the thing, and the reality, the sad reality is that now it's all more financially viable because of the unit price. So, like we were doing all this when the unit price was under 10 cents. You know, God be with the days. But now you're looking at a potential unit price of somewhere between 75 and 90 cents a unit. So it really kind of puts it into perspective. We've an issue at the moment. So we are putting solar PV on the roof. And this is the other thing. If you are thinking of putting solar PV on the roof, get in a structural engineer first. We got the funding for this at the start of the year, and it's taken us to this point to actually get the structural engineer to say, do you know what, there are problems with your roof. So we're having to go back and deal with it. Now we're allowed to extend the funding until the end of next year, so it's still going to happen, but due to these structural issues, they're going to need to be dealt with first. Nothing major, thankfully, but it's enough it's enough as a caveat to say, look, don't put any extra load on the roof at the moment. But we did these figures based on 17.8% a unit. And the savings were phenomenal. And now we're looking at the best part of 80 cents a unit. So the savings are eye-wateringly good. The payback is is what was a 7-year payback is now a 2-year payback.
And I'd probably be a tiny bit more cynical than Nick about the payback time, but I mean, I think it is worth doing.
Oh no, absolutely.
Yeah.
That was a best case scenario payback.
Best case scenario, and probably depending on what part of the country you're living on, and so on.
Because of course, and it's only ever this thing with the solar PV is it's only ever going to be a little bit of a sticking plaster onto a rather large wound, but because we proved that we could make it viable on the old rate, with the new rates, then it is definitely viable.
The payback is much quicker. Yeah, I mean, we have PV panels on the house here. We had a 2.1 array, and now it's about 4.5. And I used to work in Sheemsith here, and we put 40 panels on the roof. So I think the main thing for a theatre venue or for any arts organisation that's considering installing them is the more active that your building is during the day. So, for example, if you do a lot of events during the day, the more, if you have a cafe, if you heat water, those are the areas where the PV panels will really kick in. So if you're a sort of multi-purpose art centre with a lot of activity during the day, you will benefit most. Whereas if you're a theatre that's used mostly in the evening time, unless you've got battery storage, it's going to be a little bit less useful. Now, there is the whole feed-in tariff, as you all know, has finally come in. I'm waiting to get my first payback from the state or from Electric Ireland, but it's going to be quite small. So nobody is going to really install panels on the roof of their theatre to generate a big revenue stream. So just if you're thinking about doing that, that's not the way it's going to work, because you'll be encouraged by the grid and by ESB networks to use ideally up to 70% of your electricity yourself.
Yeah.
So just to bear that in mind, without storage, that battery storage, which is expensive and has environmental kind of negative question marks over it, without that, you just need to think about the usage of your building, how you're using it. But it will always heat water. So if you're using oil to heat your water at the moment, or indeed if you're using gas to heat your water, that's where PV panels will really come into their own. So we've been heating our water at home since April. We haven't used any gas or electricity. We've used the PV panels. So that is definitely a saving.
Yeah, and if you're one of these venues that kind of opens at 6 o'clock for an evening performance, then it's just not worth the investment.
No, it's not going to be. Yeah.
Even with battery storage, because you're just not going to be able to store enough.
Yeah, exactly.
So at best, you might, with 50 panels, you might get box office for an hour on battery storage, and it's just not worth it. So the likes of Dunamaze, because we have the cafe open all day, the lights in the cafe. My idea was, if I can generate enough electricity most of the time to cover the lights in the cafe, happy days. I'm
heating your water.
It's worth it, But
are there any? I'm just wondering if there are any questions, Nick. Has anybody got?
Yeah.
Yes, Niall.
It's more just a suggestion, and I think this has been covered before in the last meeting. But what we managed to do up here is we got the cultural services buildings in Donegal through the Donegal County Council to get a grant from the European Union and Donegal County Council to put solar panels on PV panels in each of the buildings, and we did it as a collective so that we ended up with a better rate of install. We're only beginning to see the issues, the benefits of that now. But yeah, I agree. If we can cover enough electricity to pay for the lights in the cafe bar, which are we've got full glass windows and we still have the lights on all day long because it's just the way it is, the nature of the space. But collective bargaining has been a huge benefit up here for us. We do have some battery storage, so we're up to 12 kVA or 12.5 kilowatts per hour in battery storage, which we're beginning to see some benefits for, in particular because they're during the day, and the evening shows a little bit of savings there. But again, it's really the standing charges that are going up, not the usage, so it's kind of waiting to see where we are after the budget to see if we can afford any more.
Yes. Yeah. I know, for example, we, in the sunniest days this summer, we would have generated 29 kilowatts during the day, which is great, exporting a nice chunk of that to the grid. But in November, December, there are days when you'll be generating zero. Yeah. So people just need to be realistic about matching their usage and what's the generating capacity.
Yeah, you won't really see the benefit. Go ahead. Sorry, I was just going to say you won't really see the benefits until the spring months. Yeah, we've got them in now. The winter will be dark. We're not going to get that much, but the spring months may start to see some real benefits. So fingers crossed.
Yeah. Yeah,
What
absolutely.
often happens is if your panels are divided so that maybe you have some panels facing southeast and some panels facing southwest, and then you'll get sort of maximum exposure over the course of a day, which can help, particularly if you're looking at lighting or water heating.
Yeah, and if each of your panels are individually controlled, because certainly with some of the arrays, and if you go with a cheaper array, then the control is over the whole line. So you want each panel to be individually controlled, and then that way you get the maximum out of each panel. So it's a little bit more expensive on the install because there's a little bit more technology in with it. But if basically if half your panel is shaded, the other half is still working. Whereas if it's a single array line, if half of it's shaded, then the half that isn't shaded is only working as well as the half that is shaded. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Nice.
that's something to be cognizant of as well if you are looking to get it done. But also, I mean, the heritage is a big problem. My biggest issue was that this whole thing couldn't be seen from the road because of the Dunamaze being the old prison. So, but thankfully, all of the slated roof that we have is that's facing in the right direction. Effectively, can't be seen from the road. So we will be able to expand into it eventually, but it is going to take the okay from Heritage to do that. And I know that some of the venues, like the Town Hall in Galway, would be in the same boat because they're the old courthouse and so on. Yeah. It's handier with the new builds. But
you'd like to think that common sense might prevail, though. That
yeah,
climate change.
So,
our heritage is under threat from climate change, so maybe we might be.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Is there anybody else? I know Anna has. You want to?
Could I ask a question of Niall, Katrina, just to say that
Yeah.
in terms of the assessment and the install, was Donegal County Council involved in the setting up of that collective discussion with both the assessment and the installation?
Yeah, it was Donegal County Council. It was about 3 years ago. It was a 3-year project, but it only lasted for 2 because of COVID. But basically, it was a Donegal County Council through we call it this. It's a SmartTech group. So it's the 5 cultural service buildings in Donegal, and it was the county council who carried out all the assessments, and they did all of that work for us. So basically, we were the guinea pigs, for want of a better phrase. So hopefully over the next few years, as the group of the buildings, we'll actually continue to expand on our energy saving where we can, both digitally and physically within the building.
And I suppose they're inspired by the fact that the cultural centres are largely funded by the local authority. So those savings are going to matter a lot to them. Yeah,
our building isn't directly run by the county council, the local authority, but it is funded by it and it's underwritten by it. So it's their building, but the company, the theatre itself, sort of rented from them, if you know what I mean. So they're responsible for the fixtures and fittings as such. So, you know, it's been a long haul to be part of that group. But now that we are, you know, I've certainly seen a huge benefit to all of us working together, and, you know, want to move on now. It's literally just coming to an end this week as a group, but we all want to keep it going because there's still other savings we can do, in particular over the hot water issue in buildings, you know, and just keeping the place ventilated properly. Yeah,
that's a really positive move, isn't it? It's great to hear. Yeah. Anna, over to you.
I suppose in the same vein, we've been talking, and Katrina has been talking with Paddy Dillon of the Theatre Green Book, who I think addressed a similar group to this, maybe during COVID. So it might be a year and a half ago, Katrina, I think, isn't it? That long ago?
Probably about a year ago, yeah.
Yeah. So just to say that we'd be very happy to convene, I suppose, maybe a more extended discussion, working with Nick and AIST and all of the people in the venues across the country that are working directly on energy usage and consumption and adapting their buildings and indeed their programs. We're thinking that an event sometime in November might be a good time to bring everybody together and to look at the usage and wastage aspect of things in the way that we're talking about this morning, but also planning for adaptation and sustainability and into the future, and coming up with the type of energy action plan that Katrina has been working with a number of venues on, as well as looking at whether it's solar PV and other developments, and how to maybe evolve collective approaches, whether that's by county or by network or by communities of interest, is one discussion that Katrina had initiated with the SEAI a number of weeks back. But I think a lot of the developments from here, the very urgent and immediate concern is the cost issue and the bills that are going to come in the next month. But that doesn't mean that the longer term, maybe more climate urgent issue of adaptation and you know, what to do in the future to be more sustainable, those questions still remain. So in tackling the immediate and short-term cost ones, there's also a need, I suppose, to look back and look again in parallel at the adaptation measures that may be required and how to do those, I suppose, effectively and sustainably, but maybe with the advantage of the experiences that maybe Niall has had or Katrina has had working with her group, and indeed the expertise of people like the Theatre Green Book and Paddy Dillon and other developments that have, you know, already happened in other sectors. This is an issue right across Europe for all arts organisations right across Europe. And the activities and the expertise and support of the Theatre Green Book is now being made available to, you know, arts organisations in every country across Europe, or at least every country across Europe is looking to access that expertise. So our suggestion would be that we have a bigger conversation around all aspects of both the immediate and the urgent and the short term, but also the very important sustainability and adaptation measures into the future, led by Katrina and the Green Arts Initiative. And we'd welcome your suggestions on agenda topics and issues that you'd like covered. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a, you know, I sometimes wonder when people come to sessions like this, they're probably looking for us to kind of cast a magic wand and fix everything. But I would say that, you know, individually, people have wonderful suggestions themselves. So I think it's sharing the efforts that people are making. I mean, the whole issue of the cost of electricity and the cost of heating is so huge. I really am very conscious of that, and that venues are really troubled. It's kind of an existential angst as to how they're going to deal with it. And I suppose some of that we don't have any control over. I would say that it looks like that gas, the sort of wholesale price of gas is coming down, that it hit a kind of peak towards the end of August. And that was ironically driven by the fact that so many European countries are stockpiling gas to make sure they have enough to get through their winter. Now they're all reached that sort of 86%, their gas storage is full. So that pressure at least is going to ease off. So the hope is that in the new year, it already has eased off somewhat. Unfortunately, a lot of the electricity suppliers have kind of future-proofed themselves by buying gas in advance, and they've bought it at very high rates. So some of those price increases are baked into the price that we're going to pay probably through until February or March, and then it'll ease off. But I don't think it's ever going to go back to what it was, you know, like 2 years ago. Even a year and a half ago, there were other pressures that began to build on the price of energy and so on. So it really is worth coming together. Some solutions might seem a little bit off the wall, but you know, if we think about if you're running a venue and you've got a local group that are coming in to use your building, sometimes that can be very relaxed. People come in, they're allowed to be there for the whole day. They may be there from early morning till late at night. They leave the auditorium and go off and have a cup of coffee and so on. So it's worth looking at all of those practices that we're so used to having and seeing if any of those can be changed without, I suppose, offending or upsetting other people too much. And finally, I'd say anything that's creating heat is costing you in energy. So the biggest energy users at home are going to be your dryer, your dishwasher, your oven. Those are the things more even than lights at home. So those are the big users that are using 2 and 3 kilowatts an hour. So those big users now have the potential also to be savers. So just look at all those big items that are using over a kilowatt of electricity per hour. They're the things you really need to bring down. And then the other thing is just to look at that curve. If everybody looks at that curve at home domestically and in a work, the 5 to 7 slot, can we work around that? Can we depress that curve? Because it's when that demand increases between 5 and 7 that the ESB networks or air turns on the extra gas generation. And that's when we hit crunch time. So if we can flatten that curve and pray for wind, those are the two things that will get us through in terms of supply. So if, and just maybe to finish on my part by saying, if anybody does have any questions that they don't want to share now, but that they want to ask us, feel free to email obviously Theatre Forum or Katrina@greenarts.ie, and if I can help you, I'd be happy to do so. Nick, do you want to say anything?
Not really. I think that's it. I did have something in my head, but it's gone out of my head. So I don't know. I'm just sitting here trying to remember what the hell it was.
It's true to say, Katrina and Nick, isn't it, that in previous discussions around this, we've I suppose broached the subject of, you know, your days of the week, your opening hours, your scheduling, when you might be sort of semi-open just for box office versus a performance or indeed rehearsals, or and I think there is probably work to be done as to how you might schedule a program and look at your opening hours to maintain, when you are open, a sense of a very welcoming, open, fully animated space for people to go to a performance or go to a workshop and enjoy that space, rather than feeling that they're in semi-darkness and everything is being sort of constrained. So it's striking the balance of reducing your usage, reducing maybe your opening hours and times of the week, but when you are open, making everything work as efficiently as it can to animate the space and to make audience members or people who are, you know, attending whatever it is they're attending, as welcome and as comfortable as possible. So I suppose there is a balancing act in that as well.
That reminded me of what it is. You're all aware of the public buildings, that you're not meant to put your heating on more than 19 degrees, and you're also meant to switch it off 2 hours before the end of the day. So we've kind of had to do a little bit of jiggery pokery in here. So we're shutting down the heating at 3 o'clock. Well, actually, the heating only just went back on today. I was making everyone suffer until today, but I got out of bed this morning and thought, no, I'm going to have to go into work and put the heating on. So the heating is running at the moment from 9 till 3, and then we've got it coming back on in the evening of a performance for another couple of hours, just to take the chill off the foyer. But 19 degrees is the max, and 2 hours before end of day. So our end of day is variable. So I think the way to do it, and the way to kind of try and do what the government are wanting us to do, is to kill it for that period in the middle of the day, for a bit. But you have to balance as well as how well your building is insulated, because you don't want to end up in the old scenario like when your parents were telling you about the immersion. So don't let the place cool down totally. It might be worth setting it so that it runs a little bit lower for a while and then comes back in. Might be the most efficient thing. But you'll be able, you'll tell fairly quickly how much energy you're using, and which is the handiest way for your own particular building.
And one final thing that Anna had actually mentioned to me earlier on, but I'll just mention it, and that is that the SEAI do have a scheme now where there's a €2,000 voucher for an energy audit. So that's open to small and medium enterprises. So if you haven't availed of it, I'd highly recommend that you do so. We might see if we could send out the link to that, maybe Irma afterwards. I don't have it directly to hand, but if you Google SEAI voucher audit, you'll find that information. That's well worth doing. If you haven't done it up to now, I'd highly recommend it. I
think the more you spend on your electricity, the cheaper it becomes as well. I think there's a threshold where if you're spending over a certain amount, you get the audit for free, as far as I recall.
Okay.
I think it boils down as being more or less free, because I think for most small and medium enterprises, it would only cost about €2,000. So it kind of more or less covers most of it. Yeah, hopefully. So. Eva, yes, go ahead. Now you're on mute, so if you,
Yeah, how you doing? One of the things, we were very fortunate to pre-COVID that we did an energy audit and moved the majority of our stuff to LED. And we also reduced our KVA. We were set up for originally for the size of a small village, and that's made a huge difference. So I definitely recommend looking at the MIC levels. But one of the things I was looking for, I want to do some in-house training with all our staff on reducing consumption, because obviously it's not about reducing our costs, it's just about what can we do as a business And I'm wondering, I'm finding it very difficult to find resources out there that we can almost copy and paste information, because we're not experts in that field. And I'm wondering, has anybody come across any resources that we could use to do some in-house training on reducing consumption on a day-to-day basis?
I would have
I
thought
know
the
the-
SEAI guide for small business is probably one of the most relevant.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's all the Julie's Bicycle have lots of interesting information, and your own Green Theatre has lots of information.
There's a bit of information on the Green Arts pages.
Green Arts, yeah. There's lots of information out there. Julie's Bicycle, Green Arts, and SEAI should have a decent amount of info. But if you're able to avail of the energy audit as well, that would no doubt be part of it too. They'll be able to, because they can tell you where you're using most, where you're likely to save most, and no doubt they'd be able to lead you in the right direction, and then that could be disseminated to the staff.
And the SEAI do run a kind of an online course that you can do.
I've done it.
You've done it, fair play. Yeah,
Yeah, I don't. It's not really hugely beneficial.
Not really.
To be
That's
honest
kind
with
of
you.
what we felt as well. I mean, I suppose
Yeah.
what we did with the venues and the Greening Venues pilot project is we went into the venues and we
Mhm.
delivered that kind of, we went through all of that, maybe not exactly specifically around energy, but really about, I suppose, building up an understanding and building up a sort of group dynamic, which I think is critical. But I'd even say, Eva, is it a venue you're in?
Yeah, we've an art centre, but we're open almost 12 hours a day because
Yeah.
we do room rental to the community as well. And,
Okay.
there's
One thing
multi-purpose.
I find very useful, and Sheem says, I just gathered together the whole staff team and we walked through the building as if from the time that it opened up in the morning until it closed at night. And simple things like the first person who came in the morning used to turn on all the lights and
Yeah.
then go head off. But the box office didn't open till 10. So all the lights were turned on at 9. The lights in the toilets were turned on. The lights in the corridors were turned on. So we color coded the light switches so that when the first person came in, they just turned on 1 or 2 lights, enough for the building to be safe. When the box office person came in, they turned on the next set of lights. And when the front of house people came in at night, so there was 3 color codes. And then we put sensor lighting in the toilets, because otherwise those toilets had been turned up, were on from 9 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock at night. So it was, so, but it's, if you involve the other people in the building with you while you're doing that, I think those people will come up with those suggestions, because it's, in a way, it is, a lot of it is common sense, and people are doing this at home. So I begin by doing that. And if we find anything else that would be, it's something we could maybe think of doing ourselves. I suppose it's just that every building is so different and they're so unique that we could be making suggestions that are not relevant. But I think that just simple walk through, pretend you're the first person in the morning, but you all come together and then somebody goes in, classic thing, fill the kettle and put it on.
Yeah.
Don't fill the kettle, just put enough. I mean, these are really simple things. You know these yourselves, but
No,
it's amazing. It's
It's
amazing how those habits are so ingrained. I'll fill the kettle because somebody else will want a cup of tea, but the next person might be in for another hour. And meanwhile, you've used a kilowatt of electricity boiling up the kettle. So simple things like that, I think, if everybody, like people used to turn on the Burco for hot water 2 hours before a performance, when in fact only maybe 10 people had a cup of tea before the show. Most of them had a cup of tea at the interval. Well, then just turn on the Burco before when the show was starting, and boil the kettle when people are coming in. But it's with your front of house staff, with your the people who are actually working in the building. They are the ones that will.
They're the best people to do it as well, because you'll find that once you actually just start the conversation with the staff, that they'll all have ideas as to what
absolutely,
what's
they really
unnecessary.
will. And I used to use a little trick where, and I got this from somebody else, so I can't claim it was my idea, but I would go around to everybody's office maybe once a month and check if their screens were still on or their computer. And I would, if they were off, I'd leave a little note saying, please remember to turn off your screen. And if they were on, I'd say, please remember to turn them off. And if they were off, I would leave them a chocolate. And that was like a little incentive to say, we've noticed that you've turned it off. And maybe timers for, if you've got a photocopier, put that on a timer so that it automatically goes off at a certain time of the day when it's generally not used. I would do the same with fridges, I have to say. I wouldn't be free, keeping, 50 bottles of or cans of Coca-Cola cold for 24 hours a day. It's not necessary. Turn them on at a certain time of the day, don't open the door in between, and they should be fine. So there's things like that, I think, that all help.
Okay.
But you will find that the people working with you will come up with those ideas.
Well, we have a caretaker who doesn't turn on lights at all. I'm the one who's go around turned on the lights for exhibitions and stuff because we're in pitch darkness.
Yes.
But recently, I went in and switched on the light, and I looked and I went no, and switched it back off again.
Yeah.
But again, I would have been one of the worst people about the computer, leaving it on standby.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I started researching, preparing slides for an in-house thing that I went, oh, I didn't realize that about the.
That it still uses quite a lot. I mean, I think when you leave your desk, as you're leaving your desk, even if you're going for a cup of tea, just turn your screen off.
Yeah.
Just get into the habit. Even with my laptop, if I'm getting up to make a cup of tea, I send it to sleep. If I'm going to be away for more than an hour, I turn it off.
Yeah.
All of those things. Standby, people to forget, like you might be watching something, have a television on for 2 hours, it uses X amount. But if it's on standby for 22 hours, it's almost using as much during those 22 hours as it is during the 2 hours that you're watching.
But you see, that stuff we're not aware of, Katrina, but
Sure.
that's why I was wondering, was a resource that, like the HSE, I found a website that had great posters and stuff that they'd created and a list of things that people should be doing. And I'm going, oh, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about
well,
that.
maybe we could do that, but maybe do it more. That's something we could do, but maybe do it as much as a sharing thing. So we will come up with a list, but we'll ask other people because we're never the last word on this. Yeah, people will always have ideas that we've never thought.
I'm happy to share the content that we create, but I'm not saying that it'll be even 60% of what we could be doing. But I'm very happy to share. When we've created, like.
Let's do that. Let's look at doing a kind of really straightforward sharing event where people talk about how to save and reduce on energy. I think that'd be great. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
And now I'm going to have to go. But it's been lovely. I mean, we were a small group, but it's great to have a bit of a chat. So thanks to Niall and Eva for taking part in that. And
Katrina, thanks as always. And Nick, thank you as always. As say on budget day, it's the calm reassurance and the benefit of all your insight and all your work to date is hugely helpful to everybody. So from everybody, thank you very much.
Not at all. We'll see you again soon. Thanks, guys. Good luck. Bye now. Bye. Happy budget day.
I don't know if there is such a thing.